Once again, I am Ayize Jama-Everett. I'm excited for you all to be here. This is the final Psychedelics on the Seminary lecture series. This was birthed out of a class called The Sacred and the Substance that I've been teaching off and on at Starr King since around 2004 or 5, maybe. One of the greatest parts of that class, which looks at the role of sacred plant and substance use throughout multiple cultures in the world, was our guest speakers. I was always fortunate enough to get some really great speakers to come in and share their knowledge with the class. And this year, we decided to open these awesome public speakers to the public for free and put on YouTube, and so everyone can get a sense of what we've been doing in the classroom. And I've been so fortunate and privileged to have Starr King as a place where I was not only a student, but also a professor, because there's a freedom that comes at Starr King that I think is really important and necessary, especially in this burgeoning field of psychedelics. So in speaking with the head of school and other folks, we realized that there's so much attention and so much focus on psychedelics, but there's a moral and ethical sort of empty space that Starr King is really well positioned to enter into, not necessarily, taking over, but just as a participant in some of these conversations. And so it fills me with a sort of glee. I remember when I first met Celina and we were talking, and then I found out, oh, she went to Starr King too. And I was like, oh, great. Starr King folks are all around, Unitarian Universalists are all around, and folks who are into psychedelic medicine and entheogens are all around. And so we're getting a chance to see what we can offer to this space and to this movement. There's a really great article by someone from the GTU, Sam Shankoff, and the name of the article, I referenced it in our last lecture, was, what can religion teach psychedelics? And I think that's a really good question that I hope we might be able to get into in this lecture. But before I ramble on too long, I'd love to introduce our awesome and amazing guest here today. I'm going to start with Celina. Celina, again, M.Div. All of these people have M.Divs from Starr King School for the Ministry. She has an extensive experience in the field of psychedelics and contemplative practice, with particular experience working with indigenous and spiritual lineages. She received her M.Div from the Graduate Theological Union / Starr King School for the Ministry, and is broadly interested in the application of psychedelic plant medicine from the lens of spiritual care. Her longstanding relationship with I always screw this up, I'm sorry, Kamentsa, sorry. The Kamentsa indigenous community at the Putumayo of Colombia informs her perspective on valuing how indigenous knowledge contributes to our understanding of the spiritual and therapeutic uses of psychedelics. Celina is a leader on the training team at the UC Berkeley Center for Science of Psychedelics, and also consults on indigenous reciprocity and DEI. She is also the founder and director of the Circle of Sacred Nature Church, the chair of the board of directors for Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, and the program director for Posada Natura Retreat Center in Costa Rica. Celina, welcome. Anthony Graffagnino. Yes?
Oh, yeah.
I love it. Is an interfaith Quaker chaplain who currently provides end-of-life care at Hospice of the East Bay. He attended Starr King School for the Ministry from 2014 to 2018, during which he completed a field internship at the Matare Compassionate Care Center in San Francisco, a spiritual direction certificate at the Interfaith Chaplaincy Institute, a CPE internship at Kaiser Walnut Creek, and a year-long residency at UCSF Medical Center. You were busy. While at UCSF, he completed a specialization project under the mentorship of clinical researcher Dr. Brian Anderson, developing a spiritual assessment model for chaplains serving in psilocybin therapy context. And then he has continued to expand his work in psychedelic chaplaincy by serving as a night attendant in MAPS clinical trials of MDMA and PTSD, and as a clinician in Hospice of the East Bay Ketamine for End-of-Life Anxiety study. He has published an article focused on the Enneagram as a vital tool for psychedelic journeying and continues to write on the subject. He will be attending the California Institute of Integral Studies Psychedelics Therapy and Research Certificate Program in summer of 2022 in order to create further inroads for spiritual care practitioners within the emerging field of psychedelic therapy. Anthony, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, the Reverend Emily Webb. She has a Master's of Divinity degree from Starr King School for the Ministry and a BA in Sociology and Anthropology from Lewis and Clark College. Her professional experience is as a hospice chaplain, a community organizer, and as an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister. Her professional interests include the intersection of spirituality / religious traditions and Western medical practices, with a focus on addressing moral injury among healthcare and mental health care providers. In 2021, she completed a graduate certificate in psychedelic assisted therapy and research from the California Institute of Integral Studies. Professional practice supports clergy, healers, and healthcare professionals to access inner resources for sustaining themselves and to live more authentically. She also has the honor of being one of my former students in this class, in the Sacred and the Substance class. And she's a damn good student as well. So Emily, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ayize.
Yeah. I would love to start with a question, and I'm going to address all my questions to all of you, and feel free to ask in whatever way you want. Folks, audience, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A at the bottom, and we're going to reserve a lot of time to answer questions, so don't be shy, just throw stuff in there. So I guess my first question would be, how did your Master's in Divinity serve you in whatever way you're entering the psychedelic world? Like, did it serve you? Did it not serve you? If it did so, how? And I can pick on people if you want.
I can start.
Go for it.
I'll say that just broadly speaking, I think having a theological education, and for me, I would start that as I went to Catholic school. So for me, it started pretty young, but having a framework for thinking about religion and spirituality and a classroom in which to discuss that, and people who are mentoring and teaching and wise and experienced, and thinking through the bigger questions about ethics, existence, suffering, celebration, community is a really fundamental part of why I think we're here and why I think sacred plants exist, and our relationship with them evolves from answering those big questions. So being unafraid to look at those big questions, and being unafraid to think complexly, if that's an adjective, I'm not sure, but to think differently and to think critically is something that I don't know that my peers, for example, who were social workers or who, were nurses or just came at the field from another angle, don't bring. So I think there's a lot of value in what an M.Div brings to this field and work. And I think we're just beginning to understand what that is in the US context, especially.
Celina? What do you think?
Yeah, I'll just chime in. Yeah, I feel like my M.Div experience at Starr King was really fundamental to allowing me to deepen my work. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is freedom, like the freedom to really follow my passion, to follow what I know to be true, what feels true in my heart and in my spirit, and to find a framework and an institution that supported that expression in so many different ways was just so powerful. And I think it really creates the environment where you can follow your dream and you can follow what feels right to you in terms of what religion means, what spirituality means, what healing means, how healing is so interwoven in those concepts. And for me, that's what a lot of the indigenous perspective and my own experience in indigenous communities really elevates that broader context of healing and the importance of considering just expansive ways of thinking about that and the interconnection that we all can carry and how that can carry us through in ways. And then, of course, I think, specifically relating to psychedelics right now, just an education rooted with a counter oppression lens and all of that was just so fundamental. How we were just really like drilled. I feel like Starr King like really drills that into you. And I think now, particularly with the important questions and emerging issues that are coming up in the psychedelic space, like I really feel like that will dictate whether this field is able to grow ethically and in a good way or not. And I think it really is that simple. So how we engage in those issues is just so fundamental right now. And I think Starr King really continues to support that for me, even just reflecting back on my experience there. Yeah.
How about you, Anthony?
Yes, as I'm hearing Emily and Celina answer this question, I'm reminded that an M.Div degree, and particularly I think one from Starr King, is a really complex thing. Like when we ask ourselves, or I'm sure when the people listening to this chat get asked, what are you learning in seminary? There's probably no two people who are going to say the same answer. And I think what's really beautiful about that is that my understanding of the particularly psychedelic therapy context, which is only one manifestation of the use of psychedelics, but within that context, there is not only one function that a facilitator plays. In fact, it behooves whoever's holding that space to be able to perform multiple functions and to hold multiple hats. And in addition to being able to view the world with a freedom or a free thinking sense like Emily talked about, or to have a real grounding in ethical accountability in counter-oppressive praxis and things like that. Some of the other functions that come to mind for me are, I'm thinking back to classes where we learned about ritual at Starr King, where we learned about how to incorporate multiple ways of seeing the world into ritual, where we learned about the fact that ritual connects individuals to larger communities, and it bridges one community to another. And that is an important part of the beginning of a psychedelic therapy session. And we learn how to hold space and how to really listen, as opposed to just projecting our own ideas of what's happening. And so silence and listening, also an important part. And then finally, really speaking truth, being honest and saying difficult things is really central to my experience at Starr King, and helping other people to find their voice seems to be also a really important part of integration from psychedelic therapy processes. And so oscillating between those different roles is a really fluid and organic thing. And I think the Starr King M.Div program teaches us how to hold those multiple hats and how to do that navigation. And so does life, but Starr King is such an intensive of that. And so I think it really fits beautifully.
I swear, no matter where I go, like I know someone who's gone to Starr King when they speak publicly. There's just something about how, we're trained to be in community with each other, to both give and to receive at the same time. So I really appreciate you all. Just sort of, you resonate very much with my experience at Starr King. And because we're talking a little personally, I'm wondering, to the degree that you're comfortable, if each of you would be willing to talk about what got you into, the psychedelic world, the psychedelic trainings, your own experiences, work experiences, to whatever degree you're comfortable. I think it'd be really important just to hear maybe where you were before Starr King and where you were after Starr King in terms of that work? In the name of time, I'm just going to pick someone, okay? I'm going to start with you, Anthony. How about that?
Okay. So for me, I was first introduced to psychedelics in the context of my adolescence and in the context of experimentation and in some sense, just countercultural, exploration of consciousness, which, there's maybe a little bit of risk in talking too openly about that, but at the same time, the stigma that gets placed on one way of experimenting with our own consciousness, that's something that I think we all have the responsibility to try and to really name. So that was how I was introduced to the world of psychedelics, and in a way that was part of the process that led me to want to pursue ministry in general. However, my own, I guess I want to say recklessness or just my life path led me to actually stopping that use completely maybe about 10 years ago. And I found myself really wounded by some of the experiences that I actually had in that experimentation. And so I now find myself returning to this context as somebody who spent most of my college years and a little before and a little after not actually partaking in these community rituals that were going on in my community, but sitting on the sidelines and helping others through it or being a witness. And that's still where I feel myself to be. And I still carry some wounds from that, but I find more and more that it's actually those wounds that have begun to help me really show up fully and to connect with things that surface for others in those spaces. And so I'm still really in an active process and very much at the beginning of this as a professional endeavor, but I think that that's going to be an element in it for a while to come.
Thank you for sharing. And thank you for mentioning the negative experiences. I always say, I'm actually not a psychedelic advocate. I don't think that everybody should be running out and doing psychedelics, right? I think they're great tools and there's a lot to be learned from them, but I think preparation and community and there's some containers that I think would be very useful for folks. And I think that when we only focus on the pluses and not the minuses, we're not doing ourselves or the work. We're not giving it its proper respect. So I really appreciate you being vulnerable and speaking to that. Emily, what about you?
Yeah, so I identify as a survivor of the mental health system, and particularly of the pharmaceutical medical model. I come from a long line of people who've struggled with mental health disorders, and myself had very debilitating postpartum depression. And so it was really a longer, more complex healing journey for me that went on for years, and really turning towards alternative medicine, holistic medicine, traditional healing practices from cultures other than my own, because I come from, again, as a white person, and I come from a heritage that has really medicalized the mind and the heart and the soul. And thankfully, that wasn't the only model I learned. I mean, I do credit your class, Ayize. I really think that learning more about the history of substances and why some substances were considered legal and some were illegal was very profound for me. So it gave me some tools to kind of question what I was getting from the medical model about my own prognosis or diagnosis or condition or what medicine was available to me. So for me, there was certainly a personal journey of reclaiming some space as a woman, particularly, and as a mom. I was also really influenced by Alette Waldman's book, actually, A Really Good Day. She writes about very, very honestly about being a mom of 4 kids and microdosing with LSD. And it wasn't until I listened to that book on audiobook, I was like, oh, maybe this isn't like the weirdest thing I could try. And so I think there's a big role specifically for moms, for parents, for working class people to just say like, hey, I'm doing this thing and I'm finding it helpful. And so then I got into the academic side of it through invitation with the medical director at Hospice of the East Bay, Rob, Dr. Cole, if you're here, hello. He set up a clinical trial for ketamine. And then that was my first kind of exposure to the clinical nature of the work. And then through the CIAS program, just got a lot more in depth around the current status and maps and everything.
Great. Thank you, Emily. You're definitely one of those students I point other students to, as you know, as someone who's sort of, engaged in the work further and kind of went beyond, what I could offer, because thank goodness there's more than just me out there, So really appreciate that. What about you, Celina?
Yeah, so my engagement started similar to Anthony in more experimental ways, younger. Is my connection okay, or is it getting choppy? I've been on Zoom for a while, so I think my computer's heating up. Is it okay, or is it?
Your audio is good, your video is a little choppy.
Okay, I might just turn my video off, unfortunately, and I might need to come back on a different device.
That's fine.
That might be better. Sorry about that. So yeah, so my experience started when I was younger, more in terms of experimentation. Found it helpful in some ways for just expanding perspective. And then when I was a senior at Stanford, I was on the women's soccer team, and I was navigating some different just challenges, some existential crisis, and I was actually in an ecological anthropology class, and I had to write a final paper, and in that process, I was researching the Amazon, and I found out about ayahuasca. And when I read about ayahuasca, it felt like the words just floated off of the page. I was very interested in it, never knew that it existed, and just felt really drawn to it. And in some way felt really drawn to just that possibility of a healing modality. And at that time, I graduated in 2002. There wasn't very much access to those experiences. Eventually, I was able to have that experience, and it was deeply, deeply healing for me. And I just kind of received a message that I knew that it was going to be a part of my life, but I didn't really know how. I did other things. I got a Fulbright. I was studying traditional medicine in India, working on different nonprofits, and then I had the opportunity to sit with ayahuasca again in a different context. And in that context, I happened to meet a teacher that I ended up working with and that I still work with. And that was about 13 years ago. And that's Taitawan from the Kamentsa community. And essentially that path in that way opened up my engagement to just appreciating that healing modality, appreciating what it is to really just understand the ritual, energetic, spiritual aspects of healing. I was actually drawn to Starr King to deepen my work in that way. Of just that exploration and what it means to create structures around that type of work. And then when I was at Starr King, I was a CPE student at UCSF, and I had the opportunity to be a guide in the same study that Anthony was in. And that really just opened my experience and eyes to what it is to work in that clinical context with these types of experiences. So that really just opened the pathway for me to really feel passionate about chaplaincy in particular and spiritual care as a holding kind of container to do this type of work. And then later, I had the opportunity to work at, and I'm now working at the Berkeley Center, embarking more deeply on that endeavor of creating a training program with a spiritual care emphasis, and also being involved with research there.
Thank you so much for that. I love that there's so many different possibilities and so many different ways for people to begin to engage with this work and to stay engaged with it. You know, one thing that you've all brought up in one way or the other is sort of this clinical or medical model. And I guess I'm wondering how you see your work as, you know, pastors, seminarians, however you define it, merging or not merging with the medical models that are being, that you know, above ground psychedelics are kind of have to go through in order to gain legitimacy.
I'm trying to sign back in on my phone. So if one of you want to go first, please.
I'll say it's a great question. I think it's one I'm still answering and may be answering for the next 2 decades or longer. This is perhaps an ambitious vision, but I would actually, instead of seeing the medical model shift to open up to psychedelics, potentially, I would rather see the medical model itself shift to be open towards indigenous ways of knowing, understanding, wisdom, perspective. So I'd rather see the medical model move more towards what I believe is powerful healing modalities and ancient wisdom that's very useful, accessible, doesn't cost a lot of money. That's my ambitious vision, right? For the medical model, specifically the mental health model, because we just have an enormous crisis in mental health, particularly among young people, particularly among the elderly, particularly among populations that are marginalized. And so the current tools that are out there, the therapy that costs $225 an hour for 1 hour once a week, is really failing the majority of people who need it or who need some type of therapeutic support. So if I can be an advocate for moving the medical model more towards a community-centered, a peer-led model, a decriminalization model, a shared knowledge model, then that would be really exciting to me. Where that is happening is really exciting, and I think rich and needed in the world. I think there's a real calling for it.
Thank you. Anthony, what about you?
Well, I just want to say thank you, Emily, for that answer. I think you said that really brilliantly. And I guess the piece that I would add, and it's a small piece because I graduated in 2018 from Starr King. And so I'm really, I don't know who exactly is on the other side of this class gathering, but I'm not that far out of seminary. And the medical model, which is still something that I don't fully understand, the medical model has been a chance for me to embark in the process of trying to, like, there's that very seminarian quote that our work, I'm going to butcher it, but something about where our great joy meets the world's great need. And so I feel that the last few years for me has been a process of kind of trying to fit together what feels like a calling for me, which is to be with people, to love people, to try and connect with people and communities. within like the context of this world, and in particular to find a way to get paid for it, because that's a reality for probably for all of us. And so I found myself working in hospital and hospice contexts so far, and having to find the ways in which I can connect to people, love people, listen to people, help people make meaning, help myself as a wounded human to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of usefulness in this world. And then I've had those moments where the context that I find myself within absolutely hurts, absolutely feels wrong, absolutely doesn't jive with the way that I would imagine healing could happen, or humanity could be recognized, or dignity could be lifted up. And in those moments, I've found myself really probably looking for answers and not finding them. And I think, to Emily's point, you know, we have an imperfect, or imperfect is saying it lightly, we have a very oppressive world. And at the same time, I think everybody who comes through a seminary program has something to offer it. And so the medical model is just one of those complex opportunities to fit our love in, and then to figure out what is the appropriate way to respond when it's wrong.
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you both so much. Sorry for the connection issues. I'll just chime in to say that I feel like so much right now is just about embracing the diversity that truly exists in the space. I feel like we're really at this important time to really just hold that people are going to be drawn towards different contexts, and what is it to just honor that choice and honor that what's right for some people in some ways and settings is not right for others, and to just allow there to be that difference and allow there to be that freedom in a way. I mean, I feel like that's a lot what we're coming up against, is really like freedom. And so like, what is it to allow people to choose their path towards health, towards wellness, towards existential crisis, towards death, towards illness, towards it all. And it's exciting to see these different streams emerging. Definitely for me, a really influential experience as being a guide at UCSF was sitting with somebody who was really clear that their husband went to the Amazon and had that whole experience, and that was right for him. But for this person, that would be crazy. There's no way he would do that. But the thought of being at UCSF in a trial, like that felt totally right for him. And that was a very significant experience for him. And for me, that really just woke up that possibility of what it is to bridge these different perspectives, having been so immersed in indigenous settings and ritual use of these plants, which that's a lot of where my heart lies. But in that work, what I really appreciate is, you know, what is it to meet people where they're at, and what is it to give true access and true just compassion for what somebody needs. And that is often in a more clinical or research context. So, yeah.
Yeah, it takes all sorts in terms of you know, access to the work. And you know, I mean, maybe this will be the next question. You know, there's a lot of conversations around indigeneity when it comes to plant medicine and you know, and psychedelics. And it seems as though it's like the closer you are to the indigenous, whatever that may mean to you, the more authentic the experience is. And most of my experience has been working with Black and brown people in East Oakland and, you know, the Bay Area, where, you know, one person was like, yeah, I'm indigenous to Oakland, you know, like, does that mean that my experience like isn't valid or isn't important? So I guess I'm wondering, you know, where do you all, you know, as we're dealing with this medical model, there's this other side, which is this like indigenous sort of this, I mean, I'll say on some levels, I've seen this sort of fetishization of indigenous knowledge. And at the same time, there's also a growing respect for indigenous knowledge when it comes around plant medicine too. I guess I'm wondering how you all balance that in your own experience and working with people and any advocacy or policy work that you do. I guess, is that enough of a question for you all?
Yeah, I just want to add before that question that I agree really wholeheartedly with what Celina said about meeting people where they're at. And I also want to be careful in my own language. While I have many critiques of, you know, the Western medical system, I'm sure glad the trauma unit is there if I get in a car accident. And I don't want to set up a dichotomy of this Western science bad, this indigenous, however you're categorizing it, good. I'm definitely like feeling the spirit of Ibrahim Farajadeh, right? One of my teachers who really, you know, really would often ask, like, what's the sort of fiction of purity that's going on here? And so how can we bring in a consciousness around, yes, there isn't one indigenous thing or way. There isn't also either one Western way necessarily. And so problematizing that a little bit, and what does each have to offer one another? And where can there be just a more mutually respectful relationship, perhaps? So I don't know if that addresses your question, but just wanted to be aware of that.
Absolutely.
That tendency.
Sorry, go on.
Just being aware of that tendency in myself as well, of polarizing. This good, this bad, this pure, this impure, this the right way, this the wrong way.
Right. Yeah.
I completely agree. I think it's so tempting, right? It's so inviting for it to be that easy and that simple, and it's just not. And I think it's just so important to also remember that even plant medicine practice in indigenous communities, there has been lots of innovation and lots of change and lots of fluidity, and lots of communities that didn't use these plants and now do. And so there really is, just a lot of diversity in that. And at the same time, I think that we do really have to engage, particularly given the reality of commercialization and the billion-dollar industry that now exists in research and in commodification of these experiences. We have to engage in that and really, really recognize just the vast inequity that exists in terms of where many of these traditions come from, and let us not let that not be so big and so complex and so too much that we're not able to engage with it. And I think that's just a really important edge right now that I think as a field and as individuals going into this work that we need to really sit with and consider. And I don't think there's even clear answers for that either, but it just requires the process of engagement, the process of discomfort, the process of just really recognizing what's happening right now, because it's happening fast, and it's fast and furious in a lot of ways. I mean, it's shocking how fast the expansion is going and how much money is often being poured into initiatives, businesses that have very little experience. And it's really in this shocking model. So what is it to really be humble and to really be able to be slow amidst something that wants to go so fast?
Thank you both for those responses. I'll add a slightly different piece, and forgive me if this is sidestepping the question. For myself, I'm reminded from time to time, that I am also accountable for looking within myself and really honestly asking the question, what's in here? And when I do that, I'm able to see occasionally that the apparatuses of whiteness, of empire, of structural racism, of the systems of oppression that we learn about at Starr King, that those are very much installed within me. And yet, rather than speaking about another group of people who I don't believe those things are installed within, another way that I can go about engaging with this work is to try and get down to, where is the child in me? Where is the part of me that is not necessarily colonized fully yet? Where is the part of me that hasn't thrown away a respect for my ancestors, or who hasn't completely broached the connection with the larger systems of life that sustain my existence every moment? I don't want to necessarily reduce indigeneity to one monolith of earth-based ideas, but I think that even outside of the world of psychedelics, we each have, and I have, the opportunity to mine down into those deep parts of myself and to encounter those things. And when I do that, whether it's through a practice that engages with plant medicine, or whether it's through a spiritual practice or a community life, then I'm able to authentically connect with other communities in a way that isn't necessarily just going to fetishize, or isn't necessarily just going to other, but is actually going to find the common thread that connects us. And I think that's really important for someone who looks like me and someone with my privileges to be able to do, if we're going to honor other communities authentically and invite dialogue and mutuality authentically in this field.
Yeah, something, sort of a common thread that I'm hearing from you all, and I was talking to a practitioner last week, and they talked about moving at the speed of trust. And that when that wasn't around, that, it was okay to take time and to slow down. And I'm hearing that said in lots of different ways in what you're saying. Just reflecting back on that. I want to remind people that they can submit questions into the Q&A. We're going to get there in after this next question that I'm going to ask all of you, which is, what's something that you've seen in the psychedelic movement and your psychedelic work that has given you hope? And what have you seen that's, made you question, or a little reticent? I'm seeing smiles. Anybody want to volunteer?
For what gives me hope is everything that's happening to broaden the conversation around psychedelics to spiritual care, to application with chaplaincy, the John Hopkins NYU study that's going to come out about religious professionals and engagement with psychedelics, I think is really exciting. What is it to really just consider that context of the work? Because to me, that's what's so fundamental. Even if it is about treatment-resistant depression or alcoholism, I think what's exciting about this is that it's also fundamentally about spirit, and it's about that awakening and how that awakening then affects other things. And concerning, I already shared, the commercialization for me is concerning, how rapid that's happening, and decrim in a way is concerning to me too. As excited as I am about it, I'm also concerned with how quickly these experiences become accessible, sometimes without the proper context or support that I think is so essential for these experiences to be engaged with safely.
So just so we don't go too much jargon, so when you say decrim, you mean, decriminalize nature, the
Just the decriminalization efforts. I'm as I said, I'm as excited about it as I'm also concerned about it. Yeah.
Right. So just for those that don't know, there are movements going on across the nation in local municipalities to make substance empty. Well, it's funny. Sometimes it's entheogenic psychedelics. Sometimes it's all drugs. The lowest legal priority in that area. So there's a bill out, SB 519, for the entire state of California. There are other states. Oregon has already passed something similar when it comes to psychedelics. And I hear you, right? Like it's both exciting and, what do you do with all that access? Like where's the community support? Where's the guidance? Where's the help? Not to say that it's not there, but are people in the local areas, are they aware of those resources that they have? So totally hear you. Anthony, Emily?
Okay. Well, I have felt hope for this work when I saw a family member of mine, I guess I'll not say his name so that just to protect his privacy, but a family member of mine began entirely separately from me, began working with psychedelic medicines. And a couple months into that process, I watched him, I witnessed him cry for the first time. First time I had seen him in my entire lifetime cry. And he cried because he brought up a memory of us like throwing snowballs in the yard. And it just touched him, it opened his heart. And I thought to myself in that moment, if like so much gets said about cosmic experience, about non-dual consciousness, about Kundalini awakenings, and I'm not in any way trying to disparage those, but when I saw this person who I had known to be a very stoic, hard-hearted, in a lot of ways emotionally repressed individual, when I saw him able to sweetly express the love in his heart on just like a Tuesday afternoon, that to me was a miracle. That was a miracle that was bigger than someone levitating, bigger than somebody shooting lightning bolts out of their hands. And it was the work that he did. It wasn't just that he took some magic pill and then his life got fixed, but the container that he was able to be a part of, and the assistance from the medicine, but also the assistance from the guides, and also the courage to set an intention and to commit himself to becoming who he felt he might be able to be. That astonished me, and it continues to astonish me. The small changes that connect us back to those very small, simple things that are both cliche and also maybe the meaning of life. That gives me hope. And what worries me is the mental health community, those who are called variously neuroatypical or mentally ill, or in whatever gray area category between the false binary of well and unwell. I am worried as this field and as this movement moves forward. I'm worried about the people who will potentially be harmed by experiences that they have, and also the people who will be left out of providing wisdom and insight and participation in this field, left out, written off, and continue to be falsely, in some cases, labeled as broken, or labeled as irreparably ill, or labeled as other or ugly, and whose experiences will not be in some ways connected with what we're learning about non-ordinary states. And that hurts me. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's another thing we learn at Starr King, who's not in the room right now, right? And where's their voice? So I really appreciate you lifting that up, Anthony. Emily, what about you?
Yeah, I'll speak just from some of my practical experience working in hospice as a chaplain here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where cannabis is, now recreationally and medically legal and has been for several years. And while cannabis isn't traditionally categorized as a psychedelic, it's psychoactive.
It is.
It is psychoactive.
It's a hallucinogen.
You can take quite a journey using cannabis. And so I saw patients accessing cannabis in their hospice care to experience a lot of relief from their physical and emotional symptoms, to get sleep, to eat, to deal with pain, to deal with stress. And also what I saw was a medical community that was very uninformed about cannabis, couldn't explain, the medical director, couldn't explain to patients how it might or might not interact with other medications they were taking, and really didn't feel comfortable prescribing or discontinuing, and just kind of threw their hands up and said, "We don't know, you're on your own." And so I agree with the other panelists in that I think, and what you said about moving at the speed of trust. And what I know from California drug and alcohol policy is that, unfortunately, big business really drove the legalization of cannabis in California, and it really created an economy that benefited white men who had money to invest legally, and really separated more and more people of color and communities of color from the profits of legal cannabis. And I think that's a real danger. Both of those are real dangers that I see with psychedelics, both the legalization or decriminalization before there's good medical data and practices accessible for medical providers to feel informed and confident, and a real risk, it's already happening, right, of this just being a way for pharmaceutical companies to increase their profit margins.
It's real talk. I appreciate that. I've been hogging the mic. I got to just sit with you all, and you get to ask my questions. I want to open it up to our audience. I'm going to read questions from the Q&A. Whoever wants to pick them up, please do. Thomas Roberts asks, have your guests discovered good ways to introduce psychedelics and religion to others, clergy and lay people? Anyone? Is that a no?
Start small. Start small. Most people still have incredibly large amounts of misinformation and myth. So you're probably going to be working upstream, dispelling myth at first.
Good point. I know one of our previous guests, Hunt Priest, has started an organization called Ligare, Ligare, which looks to give some sort of pointers and context for, at least in a Christian context, how to talk about psychedelics. So that might be another place. I think a lot of times it depends on the religious community that you're a part of, but I'll say more and more, and maybe it's just because I'm in California, but more and more in every religious tradition, I'm finding people who have, at the very least, experimented with psychedelics, and some of whom have been trained in working with plant medicine as well. So we're out there. Of course, there's always books. I'm a big fan, as you all know, of Brian Marescu's The Immortality Key, Drug Use for Grownups by Dr. Carl Hart, another great book talking about substance use in general. Yeah, I mean, I think as religious leaders, regardless of your view on psychedelics, if you're a chaplain of any sort, substance use is going to come your way. right? And, the question I think is always, how do you respond to the substance use in your community or problematic substance use in a way that still affirms a person's faith and their notion of being a just and beautiful spirit in this world that is divinely inspired, if that's in your tradition, which it is in mine.
Yeah, there's also, just practically speaking, there is a religion and psychedelics conference this weekend that Chacruna is putting on that you can definitely check out. I think there's going to be lots of panels addressing this very question. And I'm actually just very delighted with how much engagement there is that I see of people being interested. Of course, these studies that are coming out looking at religious professionals, engagement with psychedelics, and definitely it's been inspiring at our work with Berkeley of beginning to engage with this with chaplains and chaplain educators. And I think there's a real opening that's happening right now, also while respecting that in some religious traditions, altered states are against the very precepts. So how do we just engage in all of those realities is important.
That is a theological conversation that I would like to have, because I am not sure that an altered state of consciousness is against the precepts of any religious tradition, because in my understanding of, encounters with the divine, that in and of itself would be considered an altered state of consciousness. But again, that's not the class we're having right now, but I would love to have that conversation. And
I agree with you. And yeah.
That's why I want more seminarians. That's why I want more people of faith to be having these conversations about psychedelics, to see what are we actually talking about when we're talking about altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just chime in for half a second on that thread. When I've had conversations in the past where I have found a helpful reframe or a helpful framework to begin these discussions is rather than exploring the topic based on the chemistry or the pharmacology, where we'll have caffeine and nicotine and alcohol and marijuana and then into drugs and psychedelics, to cut the whole thing on a different plane, where we have, here's a holotropic breathwork practice. Here is demechanizing your walk to work by taking a different route and paying attention to the smells that go by. Here's having your life destabilized by some major upheaval or illness. Here's and then basically being able to say there are all manner of transformative and consciousness altering experiences. Some involve ingesting substances, some do not. But what are we actually aiming towards here? And what do we actually, who do we want to be, and how do we want to be with the world? And then, we can decide what's the appropriate practice or the appropriate experiment to make.
Awesome. I want to keep moving.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I completely agree on, I journey often and rarely use medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Walk with that as you see in your own path. I think so much of it is about the frame and the mindfulness that we're bringing to it. Just back to the question about resources, I put a few in the chat. I do recommend the Zendo project, specifically if anyone's doing kind of like guerrilla journeying or know someone had a bad trip. I just encourage people, it's never too late to relook at a bad trip. So I often find when I'm talking to psychedelics about people who are like, oh, I'd never do it again, or I know somebody who blah, 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 blah. And just like any difficult experience, there's so much to harvest. And there's no expiration date on our life experiences. So it's as valuable now looking at it as when it was happening. I would pause it. And maybe just, more to be said. I also really appreciated in the MAPS training that I did, the Michael and Annie, the kind of clinical team on that, said, you can get a lot out of just lying on your couch with your sweetheart and listening to 6 hours of heart-opening music. So again, like helping people think through what kind of tools do I already have? What's already present in my resource bank, in my friend bank, that maybe I'm not bringing the lens of journey work to. Maybe you don't need to go quite as far afield as you might think to have a real spiritual awakening.
I want to I want to keep it moving just because we got a bunch more questions, but this is great. This is where the meat always happens. What advice, this is from Bethany Ketchum, what advice do you have for current seminary students interested in the field of psychedelics? Where/how can one get more involved at the intersection of spirituality and psychedelics? Anyone? Celina, I feel like you're probably most suited to answer this question, yeah?
Yeah, my audio went out for a minute. Will you repeat the question, please?
Sure. It's what advice do you have for current seminary students interested in the field of psychedelics? Where/how can one get more involved at the intersection of spirituality and psychedelics?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it is probably through just independent ways of research and reading. I don't think that there's if there's a place that's going to have classes like that, I think it's Starr King, and maybe there will be more at Starr King. Unfortunately, I don't think that there's too much that has been formalized in that area, but I think it's starting to happen, definitely. And again, I think this comes back to just, that question of like real discernment and real just looking into, a slow path of really figuring out what's right for you in terms of your engagement in that way, if it comes to experiential experiences. But in terms of literature and whatnot, I think that there's definitely a lot out there that you can just access and see what you gravitate toward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'll say the formal structures are coming. They are in active construction, some of which I am a part of. But I'll say, there's a lot more focus on the psychological than the spiritual in this work, as I'm seeing right now. And there's nothing wrong with that. I also have a master's in clinical psychology, but in terms of focusing expressly on the spiritual, I think there's some catch up that we need to do, and I'm excited for that catch up to happen from seminaries, from religious leaders, from spiritual communities.
I think that's really true. I'll say that my experience in the CIIS graduate certificate program, which is a good place to go to find more people you could read their books or read their articles or be involved in studies with them. It's a big gathering place for a bunch of people who are doing this work more academically. But it was that people were, I was coming from seminary, from professional ministry. All my background is in spiritual and pastoral roles. And most of the cohort were psychiatrists, psychiatric nurse practitioners, people who had just a lot of scientific knowledge and background. And so, we would do like role models on being with someone who was having a altered state. And it was so easy for me, right? It was so easy. It just felt like, I've been with people in altered states all the time. Like that's a lot of what happens when you're dying, when you're grieving. It's a lot of what I see. But it was interesting to watch the psychiatrists kind of try to use their clinical skills, which actually weren't that effective with the kind of states that people were experiencing. I would encourage people to look into breath work. Actually, if you're looking for a way to experience an altered state that's legal, it's affordable, somewhat affordable, there's a lot that can be explored there. And for people, personally, I saw someone asking a question about imposter syndrome. Shout out to whoever asked that question. I hear you, I feel you. I wrestle with it myself. This field, meaning psychedelics, meaning professional ministry, meaning public speaking about psychedelics, is full of big egos. And so I think, once again, the work is looking at what brings you to this work. What really is it? And who are your teachers? And how are you in relationship with them? Who are the communities you're accountable to? How are you bringing people with you? Maybe who aren't like you? And what's the conversation happening there? So I would say there's nothing to worry about in terms of imposter syndrome. If you are drawn to this work, I am someone who believes there's a reason you're drawn here. So trust yourself and lean into your teachers and ask for what you need. You know, I'm a big believer in mentorship. I'm only in ministry because other curly-haired women said to me, "You are capable of this, Emily." And I said, "No, I can't because X, Y, and Z." And they said, "You're already doing it. So shut up and claim it." And I had to look at that and do the work. So if you're asking about that kind of thing, like, you're asking the right questions, just keep asking those questions.
I just want to say I completely agree with what Emily shared, and it's so delicate. It's naturally so delicate, and I feel like so much of that path and unfolding really is about embracing patience and embracing that this type of work takes time and formation and falling and getting back up again, and really just doing that over and over again. And I think that is something that we can learn from indigenous perspectives, that in those settings, it has always been with mentorship. Like, that actually is something that's pretty universal in those contexts, is that it's only through that one steps into a role of facilitation in whatever way that looks.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll add one last thing, and this one is, you know, if this doesn't feel useful, then don't take it. But in addition to finding mentors, finding communities, and finding just relationality in this work, which really I think is the bedrock of it. You know, if we're going to make this a conversation about psychedelics and spirituality, then I think it really is important just to name that each of us who have a spiritual path, that we can and maybe even need to use my own spiritual practice to do the discernment work around what am I called towards, what am I calling in, and to take seriously that facet of it. You know, it can get a little woo-woo or a little bit overly privileged to just say you can just manifest anything you want. And I think I've met many people who really feel that part of their story was ending up meeting those mentors at the right time, ending up being exposed to those teachings at the right time, because they had set an intention or reached a clarity within themselves. And that will ensure that when those connections are made, that each of us is ready to know what is ours to do, and also to know when to walk away and say that something isn't feeling right, so that we don't end up in the wrong or in an incongruent situation where we may, you know, be invited into work that isn't actually for our benefit or the benefit of others, and ends up in some cases creating harm. So yeah, inner work too.
Inner work always. I want to, Anne put up a question. I think it's really interesting. Basically, what it comes down to is, in what ways did the phenomenology of your psychedelic experience lead to intentional changes in your theology, if it did? So, through your own psychedelic journey, whatever that may have been, did that change the way you thought about your theology, your experience with the divine, mysticism?
I feel that for me, it deepened it more than anything, that I always found connection to the divine in nature, and my work with psychedelics just deepened that and made that less of a cognitive thought engagement and more of an experiential, full engagement with all of my being, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Anthony, Emily?
I think my experiences in altered states of consciousness, and I'm actually going to include like when I gave birth. I had a unmedicated birth at home and had a really transformative psychedelic experience with that. So I think that it's really been for me, if I were to give it like a theme heading, it was stop being afraid, or like let go of fear, or your fear is not serving you. And that's just been a real through line in my life, my relationship to fear, and just not letting fear be in the driver's seat so much of the time. And to connect that to Starr King and ministry and spirituality, I mean, be not afraid, be still, know that I am God. I think I am grateful for the experiences that I've had, which includes some really horrifying and negative experiences in altered states that made me examine my own resiliency, my own capacity, rethink what tools were going to be useful to me. How has that shaped my theology? Oof, that's a complicated thing, right? I'm still living that question. Like Rilke says, live the question. But it is a guiding question for me. How can I be less afraid today? How can I say no to fear today? How can I be brave today?
Thank you for that. Yeah. I'll add, and I'll try and be succinct or brief about it. Psychedelics have, through my own experiences and also just through encountering teachers and others who are engaging with them, has reminded me that this might not be like the truth, but one story that I now believe is that that the God, goddess, divine, sacred that we encounter comes from within and without. The magic and beauty that we encounter comes from within and without. The healing and insight and wisdom that we encounter comes from within and without. And psychedelic experiences can help reveal those things and help magnify or intensify or encourage those experiences. And when I have had that magic come about in my life through the use of psychedelics, it has been clear to me that the only thing that changed is that I pulled back somewhat of a veil. And that this day, this moment, this lecture series right here, the magic, the beauty, the divinity, it's right here, in here, out there. And we are I don't want to say accountable to it at all times, but it's there and it's available to us at all times. And every single day can be a day of meaning, and every single day can be a day where we truly show up and look around and do our best to be alive, and that that there is no mundane, there is no non-sacred. And that might have been a thought I had before, but this work has really, in my better moments, put that into my body. Everything is important. Everyone.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Just reflecting on my own experience, one of the things that my own experience with psychedelics, entheogens, however you want to define it, gave me a sense that I mattered to I mattered to those who came before me. That the life that I was living, like in the here and now, meant something not just for me and not just for the people that I impact now, but that, sort of the cliche is like we are our ancestors' greatest greatest hope, greatest dreams, and to have that as a felt experience shifted a lot, kind of leaning into what Anthony is saying of like, oh, like, the walking to the store and, being kind to those around you and doing the good work, that was all I needed to do in the world in order to be, loved by, generations upon generations of ancestors, right? That the big work, wasn't necessarily a, peak 5 experience in which, there was ego death and, blended into the cosmic oneness of everything, but rather just sitting and being still and walking the walk and doing the mundane normal things was a gift from the divine as well, right? So that's how it informed my theology, if that was interesting. Wayne Anderson says, I'm interested in hearing the panelists reflect on the comparison between the prospects for psychedelic access in the future and what has happened with marijuana achieving cultural acceptance through the appreciation of its medical uses. The technologies of microdosing had advanced considerably. Do you see access to microdoses of psychedelics outside the medical and therapeutic setting as a possibility, let's say, in my lifetime? And Wayne is 72 years old, he says.
We could probably spend a whole hour and a half on that question. Thanks, Wayne. Nice to hear from you. Hope things are going good. Wayne and I traveled in Turkey together on a Starr King pilgrimage. I think broadly speaking, cannabis is not regulated enough, particularly high concentration THC. I'm someone who has a lot of teenagers that I love in my life, and I am worried for their brains. I'm worried for the level of THC access their brains have while they're still growing. So I hope there's a way we do it better than we've done with cannabis. But I definitely think there's been a cultural shift due to, or a shift that's happened because of the legalization of cannabis in so many states. I wish cannabis got more respect as a medicine, as a journey medicine in its own right. Yeah, again, I fear the way that the legal market was flooded with high concentrated THC products. I fear that might happen with psychedelics. That these high concentration, high doses will become really normalized. And I've really learned a lot from the work of like Adrienne Marie Brown, and she talks a lot about the power of the small and the generative change that comes in the micro and the local. So for whatever ways we can, maybe take a lesson from craft beer and have like a hyper localized plant medicine generative community that is place-based, that would be a vision that I'd be excited about. what mushrooms can I grow, on the log in my backyard? And what's my relationship to that log? What's my relationship to that yard? What's my relationship to the soil, to the lead paint in the soil, to the whatever? So I sort of got lost in that question, but hopefully that rambling was useful.
Anybody else want to chime in on that?
Maybe I'll just say in the most hypothetical terms that that I would fully anticipate, the powers that be using any new technology or any newly in vogue, and I say newly, it's not new, obviously, but any up and coming experience to fashion it, to perpetuate the status quo, and they will inevitably or invariably center the benefits of it while hiding the fact that this is used to perpetuate the same issues that we're probably all aware of. And so so just piggybacking on what Emily said, my great hope is that that if these compounds do anything, it's not that they're going to make us more well-adjusted to a sick society by having a daily microdose pill that allows my cubicle to be more tolerable, but rather that they can that they can be used to allow every single human to honestly ask the question, what's the world I envision and how can I work towards it every single day? And that it may, in that sense, be more useful as a disruptor than as something that's going to help us just go along to get along. But I do predict that it will be packaged and peddled for that reason.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that the flooding is starting to happen, and it's only going to happen more. And I think this is really the area where education is so important, and even the work of ministry and the work of, even if these experiences aren't something that you yourself are drawn to, our communities are going to be drawn to them. So how do we, as ministers, as practitioners, as chaplains, as however our work expresses in the world, how can we empower ourselves with education and knowledge to meet people where they are at with these types of experiences? And I think there's just a real important call for that. And I would even say a true need in seminary education to embrace this topic because it is happening. So now it's just a matter of how do we want it to grow? What do we want the garden to look like? Like, how's the forest gonna really be okay in this wild jungle that's being created right now? And I really agree with what Emily and Anthony expressed around, microdosing and relationality and relationship. Like, there's so much in that, in how these substances are either, like your class Ayize, either sacred or profane. And that really is what it is. And it's the same with how we engage with our tea or our coffee or our beer or our, whatever it is. And so it's like, let's not just pigeonhole these psychedelics as the altered state path. There's plenty of ways to alter our state, right? But how can we use this path or use whatever path we're embarking on to move closer to right relationship and to a nourishing existence for ourselves and the planet?
Yeah, I have a vision of one day that, kind of what Emily was talking about, that there are local small communities that are responsive and generative, where children are taken care of and dogs are taken care of and the elderly are taken care of, and we all focus on taking care of each other and psychedelics and compounds and others are there to help in that work, but they are not the sole part of that work. In fact, it's the motivation or perhaps like the inspiration for the work, but the work is really about community, right? And about working together and joining. I cannot thank you three enough for your time and your energy and your beautiful insights. This is the perfect way to end what has been an absolutely amazing lecture series that just because of my time and energy, I'm so glad it's over, but so glad that we've been able to do for these past few months. Please know that psychedelics and the seminary. Yes.
I have one more point I want to make real quick.
You let it out.
Because someone asked about UU specific, and I think I'm the UU minister on the panel. So I want to say, I think UUs have an important role to play in this movement, particularly as it comes to criminal justice. Just like we advocated hard for marriage equality. I was in seminary, I took those classes, I learned to speak publicly and talk to reporters and marry and ordain, queer people all up and down the spectrum. I think UU clergy need to be as articulate, as informed, and as clear that the current criminal justice system is not serving anybody. And the criminalization of these substances just is horrific. And so if we're going to be doing the spiritual journey work, there also is the social journey work to do. And I do think that clergy in particular and UU communities in particular can play a role being hard advocates in that. So I just want to put that 2 cents in for the UU activists out there. I'm with you. I'm going to put my website, which has a link to my mailing list, in the chat. And thanks everyone for coming.
And if you guys want to put your emails in, please feel free in the chat. I am putting the link to the lecture series page. Underneath each image, there is actually a recording of the previous lectures. So if you missed any of them and you'd like to see some of the old ones, you can. This one will probably be uploaded within a week or so, let's say a week or so. So be able to see them there. Next spring, we will have another Psychedelics in the Seminary series. I am excited to have more people. If you enjoyed this, please tell your friends, let us know. I really appreciate everyone coming out, and thank you so much. Celina, Anthony, Emily, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. Starr King, appreciate you for putting this on. And of course, audience, thank you. All right, everybody take care and good night.
Thank you, Ayize.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.